Hello, here we are reading chapter 3 of Peter Attia's book, Outlive. I actually was able to enjoy a nice Sunday this early morning, and I read it. So it's actually pretty fresh on my mind, and I'm really, really glad. I feel like Peter kind of gives away the rest of the book uh, in chapter 3. In fact, I was a little worried that you know, are only reading one chapter. And I'm glad that we just had 1 week on this. I want to keep this podcast to an hour, so and I will read the comments as we go. But I'm going to start as usual by just making my own observations. I will be reading quite a bit from the book. I will be paraphrasing Peter's stories in my own words. Just as a note, technical note, administrative note. You know, buy the book, do whatever. I have nothing to do with Peter, but I am talking about something that he spent a lot of time on creating, and it's a very good resource. So far, I've been really excited to read it. As a side note, before I get into this, though, this week as I mentioned last week in the podcast, I was very impressed with just Peter Attia's style, his rhetorical style, his commitment to science and to evidence based kinds of things. And he actually talks about this in chapter 3. I can't wait to get there. And so when I saw that he interviewed one of my sort of anti-heroes, I was big into cycling. So something that Peter and I have in common that I find really, really fun. I know this now, having watched the interview with Lance Armstrong. And if you don't know who Lance Armstrong is, Lance Armstrong broke all our hearts. And frankly, to be more accurate, Lance Armstrong took the brunt of the collapse of cycling. I mean, mostly because of a scientist and a genius who actually was helping everyone go, quote, and I quote Peter Attia, high octane, which means they were doping in a number of ways with EPO and blood doping and all this other stuff. And so, in fact, there's an entire cycling channel dedicated to making fun of how doped up Pantani and everybody else was. And it was a really dark time. It was also the same time that I grew up with Greg LeMond, Laurent Fignon, Eddie Merckx, and Bernard Hinault. I had posters of them on my walls as a young kid. And 10, 20, 11, I'm saying probably from 12 on, I was obsessed with cycling. Used to race criteriums when I was a teenager, and until it was too dangerous to do that anymore. But one of the people that came to power really quickly was Lance Armstrong. This Texan, and he was a triathlete at first. It's interesting because I ended up going from cycling, and then people asked me to run with them. They say, hey, do you want to do this team duathlon with us? I was like, okay. So I picked up running, and then I started, running and cycling. And then finally one of them said, hey, I got this friend who's a swimmer. Do you want to do this team-based triathlon? And I was hooked after that. I saw this person do this swim, and I was like, I can do that. It was like something that I'd never really done. Of course, Peter Attia is world-class swimmer. He swims 21 miles regularly. It's actually in the book. We talked about that last time. And so he and I had that in common, and it turns out he was obsessed with cycling back when in America it was very hard to find anybody who even knew what it was about. Greg LeMond was making it more of a thing, and so all of us kind of got into it. And I'm really happy to learn that during that time, Peter Attia is 5 years younger than me, but he was just as obsessed. So that's something that we have in common. Type A personality aside, and all of that. And so when he interviewed Lance Armstrong, and I strongly encourage everybody to go watch the YouTube video. Of course, I'm not going to talk about that here. We're going to talk about this chapter, and there's lots to cover. But I strongly encourage everybody, whether or not you're interested in cycling or not, to sit through the entire Lance Armstrong interview. I don't think that there has been a more insightful, a more respectful, a more self-aware interview ever. And I went into it. I went into watching that interview with quite a bit of angst. Actually, I was kind of pissed off. I was kind of pissed off because I was like, Peter, what the hell? I'm just getting to like you, dude. Now you're going to be like giving Lance Armstrong a platform to launch his new podcast and everything else that Lance is doing now. He's becoming very popular, right? And I knew that. I'd seen that from other things. Lance Armstrong's been doing his own podcast for God forever, something like 2012 or something. And um, I listened to the whole thing with an open mind, and I found myself, first of all, I was just blown away by Peter's ability to really dig into a topic. And at one point, Lance goes, "You know more about this than I do," and he was serious. And you could see, I mean, Lance Armstrong is a very discerning guy. He's very competitive. He's kind of an asshole. I mean, I think everybody agrees. I think he would be the first one to tell you that. Um, and I respect that in some sense, because he doesn't take shit and stuff. But at the same time, he was able to respect Peter for understanding the topic so much, which meant that Lance really came just he was just himself. You could tell it was just two guys, sitting there talking and with deep respect for each other. I mean, it was really clear. I've seen Lance give interviews before, including the Oprah interview, and I mean, he's respectful and everything, but there was still kind of an antagonistic relationship between the two. But there wasn't. There's not between Peter. In fact, if you read the comments of the interview that Peter Attia gives to Lance Armstrong, you could just see it. The comments are full of praise, not for the things that either of them have done. Peter doesn't say what, but he does talk about, the closets, the skeletons in our closets, the things we've all done, and I've got plenty of my own. And it's just so the reason I recommend it, to whether or not you're a cyclist, whether or not you're a man, whether or not you are, I just the level of introspection and just aware. I just think you should watch it. I really do. Um, seriously, I went into it like getting ready to hate on Lance and Peter for giving him the platform, and then I ended up being completely converted. And by the end of the day, not only did look, I still would not be the kind of guy who would want to have beers with Lance. He wouldn't want to have beers with me either, right? He's a good dude. I mean, he does his best given what he's got going on, and he seems, like he's made a lot of changes, like really deep changes in his life. But it's nothing. I don't know that our personalities would gel very much with each other. I don't know. Maybe we'd end up being great friends. Who knows? I don't even know if I would ever actually be able to be friends with Peter. I think that I probably could be more friends with Peter. I don't know that his standards would allow him to be friends with me. Because I'm a degen. I'm just a big degenerate living in you know, an apartment here, making all kinds of mistakes instead of, you know, interviewing people like Lance Armstrong. So let's get into this chapter. So go watch that. Um, so I am going to paraphrase the story because I think the story sets the stage for this chapter called Objective, Strategy, and Tactics. In other words, how do we approach this idea of longevity, the word he hates, but what does it mean? How do we attack it? What are we going to do? And this chapter 3 kind of goes into that. It kind of outlines how we're going to go into that. And he talks about a story about a person, a woman that he knew, went back after college. He went back and he's talking to the daughter. This person is a friend of his, and he ends up talking. I'm really paraphrasing here, and it turns out to be a friend of his, and they're talking, and he's all excited to see her mother again because he hasn't seen her in a long time, like over 15 years or something. And in fact, I think she I can't remember if she passed away already, but so the I'm just gonna read it. I remember Sophia as a vibrant, athletic woman who had seemed ageless, but I hadn't seen her since my wedding nearly 15 years earlier. Becky, that's his friend, filled me in on what I had missed. Beginning in her early 70s, Sophia had undergone a steep physical decline that began when she fell while gardening. She tore a muscle in her shoulder. That soon escalated back into her back and neck pain so severe that she could no longer work in the garden or even play golf, her two primary passions in retirement. She simply sat around the house feeling depressed. This was followed by a descent into dementia in the last couple of years of her life before she died of a respiratory infection at the age of 83. At her memorial service, everyone agreed that it was a, quote, blessing that Sophia hadn't lingered in that dementia state for very long. But as I sat there in the pew, I reflected on the fact that she had spent the last decade of her life being unable to participate in any of the activities that had given her pleasure. Instead, she had been in considerable pain. Nobody mentioned that. We were gathered to mourn Sophia's biological death, but it saddened me even more deeply that she had been robbed of the joy of her final years. And this gets repeated several times in this chapter. In fact, it's given a name, and see if I can find it. The marginal decade. The marginal decade, as opposed to a bonus decade. The marginal decade is the idea that because of modern science, medicine 2.0, as we talked about last chapter, people are given unnatural long life, even though they have excruciating pain and a very low quality of life. And that's what this is talking about. It's like if you, and then he says that he leads into saying, this is, I ask all of my patients something. I ask all of my patients to sketch out an alternative future for themselves. What do you want to do in your latter decades? And what is your plan for the rest of your life? So, this is so important, particularly if you're young. A lot of you listening right now are probably very young. And I mean, this kept coming up in my mind every time I was reading a new paragraph here. I am so grateful for the decisions I made when I was young. I made a lot of dumb mistakes. I made a lot of bad decisions, but it's not like you can suddenly overnight say that you want to be healthy. You can certainly overnight say you want to commit to being healthy from that point forward, but it's not like you can snap your fingers and then change 10 years of arterial, decline. So he says here, everyone has a slightly different answer. They may want to travel or continue playing golf or hiking or playing with their kids. The point of the exercise, so the point of me having them do this exercise first is it forces them to focus on their own end game. Which to most of us, if we think about it, our natural tendency is to choose immediate gratification over long time stuff because it's hard and we don't want to do it. The second reason is because it drives home the importance of health span. We've talked about this before. So he has this really great diagram, and I wish there's probably a version of it that I could pull up. I don't think it's going to show. Can you see it? It's tiny, but it's pretty basic diagram. The guy's a financier, so he's a math guy, so he makes this diagram. Basically, it has health span going up and down, and it has lifespan going out long, right? And we go from 100% on down, and the graph is kind of, it's like a power curve, right? And if we don't do anything, we just kind of fade off and die. And he's got with 2.0 medicine, we go almost, it fades off until the very, very, very last part of the graph. And then that part gets bumped out like 5-10 years. And that's the marginal, the 10-year of suckiness that you just can't do anything. You don't have any quality. And then he talks about medicine 3.0, which is the focus on prevention and focus on, understanding things better, and that the graph pushes way out at the very top. And then it precipitously falls off, right? So, when you finally are ready to go, it's a very steep decline and it's very quick, as opposed to, kind of like just fading off and just, to this diseased old existence, which frankly gives me the chills. The idea of aging in pain and with no faculties, and I would just rather die. And I'm not telling anybody else what to do, but I really hope that society votes in. First of all, I hope society buys into this medicine 3.0 idea. And we see this more now, right? We see a lot of people that are aging a lot better. They're doing amazing things in that last. They're using that extra 10 or 12 years or 20 years as a bonus, bonus time. So they're producing some of their best artwork, or they're producing some of their, they're traveling the world, or they're writing that book that they always wanted to write, or they're mentally they're there, and everything is going on, right? As opposed to the people who have mostly succumbed to one of the four horsemen, which we talked about last time, and they're just a huge financial expense on everybody. They are miserable. They can't formulate thoughts. They can't even really communicate. They can't even sometimes remember who their family is. Nobody wants to live that existence. Why would you want to? And we talked about this last week. I don't think that there is some religious requirement to go through that suffering for yourself or for others who will benefit from the service and sacrifice they make to keep you alive and change your underwear and everything. I mean, look, I don't want to say anything bad about people who are getting into that age, but I am headed there, and so I am aware of it. At a certain point, the decline begins to steepen. Eventually, sometime around 70 or 75, give or take, your cognitive and physical capacity will diminish to roughly halfway point. So, so that's the thing that's I find super interesting is that I've already topped over. I'm metabolically I'm probably 40. Um, I mean, my max heart rate is 180, which is they say is supposed to be a 40-year-old. So, I mean, I let myself go this last couple of years, but I feel like because I was a Mormon for so long and I took care of my body so much, I don't know. After last night's dancing and drinking, in case you don't know, last night, if you want to see me completely off the chain, this is why I probably couldn't be friends with Peter or Lance or anybody who has self respect. I just was dancing the whole night away. I danced like five hours last night live on the stream, and just dancing to 80s music on 80s dance party with DJ Sinclair. It's absolutely awesome, and it was fantastic. And we were on a Zoom call, and and my legs still hurt today, and it was so much fun. And I burned something like 4,000 calories dancing, but I had fun, man. I had really fun. Anyway, so at a certain point I mean, when I can't dance anymore, I'm going to be really sad. Arbitrarily to define the point, medicine 2.0 steps in and pushes you out. The next obvious question after saying, "Hey, what do you want to, what do you want to do? Do you want to play golf? Do you want to travel? Do you want to dance? Do you want to ride your bike? Do you want to spend time with your grandkids? What do you want to do?" The next obvious question is, how do we accomplish this? How do we lengthen our lifespan while simultaneously extending our health span? How do we stave off death, be the horseman, while slowly or even reversing physical, cognitive, and emotional decline? What's the plan? Most people take the wrong turn here, and they say that eat this, don't that, do this, don't that, eat these, take these supplements, read these books, do what this book says. Those are tactics. But tactics without strategy, as Sun Tzu says, tactics without strategy is the noise before defeat. To achieve our objectives, we first need to have a strategy, an overall approach, a conceptual scaffolding or mental model that is informed by science, tailored to our goals, and gives us our options. Our specific tactics flow from our strategy, and the strategy drives from our objective. We know what the objective is by now, but the strategy is key to victory. And just the very reading of this book seems at odds with modern society. We want immediate answers. Tell me what to do, as opposed to thinking about the strategy for ourselves and our own goals. I'm reminded that Peter takes the same approach to medicine and to longevity that I do to education. it's very important that we develop autodidactic habits so that we set up what is our strategy for learning, and then what are the tactics. You know, I see people that want to become hackers, for example, and they immediately throw all their energy into doing hack the box or something like that, and they haven't really given a lot of thought to the overall strategy, and the end goal, other than I want a job doing hacking, right? And so they spend all their time doing the tactics as opposed to necessarily talking about the strategy, where this is going to take them, how this is a piece of a puzzle, right? Other pieces of it might include, I don't know, meeting actual people in the industry, finding a mentor, going to security conferences, and getting a sense of the culture. Those are all pieces of the puzzle, and they're a part of a bigger strategic view of how to go about it. And Peter nails it in this same sense. It's just a different goal. The mission here being longevity and quality of life in our latter years. The big mistake people often make is to conflate strategy and tactics, thinking they're the same. They are not. I like to explain this distinction using one or more memorable boxing matches of all time. He describes this match so well. I'm just going to read it. I was going to paraphrase it, but he's just so good at describing it. So he talks about the famous match between George Foreman and Muhammad Ali. And if you haven't heard about this, first time I heard about it was, I mean, I lived through it, frankly, but I also they refer to this in Daredevil, actually. Yeah, Daredevil. There's a reference to this match. Muhammad Ali versus George Foreman, the famed Rumble in the Jungle. It took place in Zaire in 1974. Ali's objective, obviously, was to win the match against Foreman and regain his title that he lost. The problem was Ali faced was that Foreman was younger, stronger, meaner, and favored to win. It's hard to reconcile with this jovial guy who sells grills now, but back then George Foreman was considered the meanest SOB who ever laced up boxing gloves. He was viewed as literally invincible. The pundits all agreed that as colorful and loved as he was, Ali did not stand a chance, which is why Ali needed a strategy. Ali knew he had a certain slight advantage over Foreman in that he was faster, more experienced, and mentally tougher. He also knew that Foreman was a hothead and prone to anger. Rather than try to counter Foreman punch for punch, Ali decided he would attempt to induce the younger, less seasoned fighter to wear himself out, getting him frustrated, tired, and vulnerable. If he could accomplish this, he knew it would be more of an even match. That was his strategy. Make Foreman angry. Then let him flail around until he exhausted himself, and Ali could mount an offensive at that time. From this strategy flowed the tactics that are now legendary. First, come at Foreman with a series of right jabs, an obvious, even disrespectful punch that was guaranteed to make Foreman mad. Nobody hits the heavyweight champion in the world like that. Ali then let an enraged Foreman chase him around the ring and press him up against the ropes, wasting energy while he concentrated on running to minimize the damage he absorbed. The famous, quote, rope-a-dope. For the first few rounds, everyone thought Foreman was absolutely crushing Ali, including Foreman. But because Ali's strategy was to try to outlast Foreman, he had trained himself to endure the abuse. By about the fifth round, you could almost see Foreman realize in his face, damn, I'm really gassed. Meanwhile, Ali's superior physical conditioning meant that he had much more left in his tank. He went on to win the match in a knockout in the 8th round. The point is that the tactics are what you do when you actually are in the ring. The strategy is the harder part, because it requires you to carefully study your opponent, identify the strengths and weaknesses, and figure out how to use those two things to your advantage, well before getting into the ring. In this book, this is what we'll try to do in 3-part strategy: objective, strategy, and tactics. What's our strategy? So, and then he talks about the strategy. Living long means delaying death from the 4 horsemen. And we talked about that. Yeah. Aging is characterized, what is aging? Aging is characterized by a progressive loss of physiological integrity leading to impaired function and increased vulnerability to death, according to a paper in 2013. So he talks about COVID. So COVID came along and basically just reaped a bunch of people who, you know, kind of an opportunistic kind of disease that took down the weak, the people that had allowed themselves to be, brought down. And we have to watch out for that kind of thing. And you got to. It's not just reacting to it when it happens or making a vaccine or something. Um, Here's another way to think of it: lifespan deals with death, which is binary. You're either alive or you're dead. But before that happens, sometimes long before, many people suffer through a period of decline that I would argue, quote, is like dying in slow motion, like Becky's mom. I mean, this whole section really just freaked me out. I think about health span and its deterioration in terms of three categories. First, cognitive decline. Our processing power slows down. We can't solve numbers anymore. We can't remember things. We can't remember passwords. That's pretty much me. The second vector of deterioration is loss of function of our physical body, chronic pain, and stuff like that. Um, Patients rarely expect physical decline to affect them. I ask patients all the time to be very specific about their ideal future. What do they want to do when they're older? It's striking how rosy their predictions tend to be. They feel supremely confident that they will be still snowboarding and kickboxing or whatever when they're that age, when they're in their 70s and their 80s. And then I stop and explain to them, look, in order to do that, you will need to have a certain level of muscular strength and aerobic fitness at that age. But even right now, at age 52, for example, your strength and maximum volume uptake are already barely sufficient to do those things. And they are virtually certain to decline from here. So your choices are A, surrender to the decline, or B, come up with a plan, start now. And when I read that, I was like, damn, am I too late? Am I too late? If I start, God, if you start trying to be healthy at 60, you can, right? You can. But I mean, how much worse is it to start trying to be healthy at 65 or 70, or even 50? At 42, I was in great shape, man. I was in fantastic shape. And then stress and a bunch of other things came in that really affected me, emotional decline and stuff. And that kind of got to me. So no matter how ambitious your goals are for the latter years, I suggest you familiarize yourself with something called the activities of daily living. This is a checklist used by health people who take care of the elderly. The list includes basic tasks such as preparing a meal for yourself, walking around. Now imagine your life without even the ability to feed or bathe yourself or walk a few blocks and meet friends for coffee. I don't want to imagine that. I really don't. I really don't want to. I think he's trying to scare us to take everything seriously. Uh, it did scare me. It really did. I mean, like, what kind of old person am I going to be? The third and final category of deterioration, I believe, is emotional health, and this one got me really, really, really introspective. Um, Unlike the others, this one is largely independent of age. It can inflict outwardly health younger people in their 20s, or it can creep up in your middle age, as it did with me. Um, or it can descend later in life. This whole idea of emotional health, I have a feeling for me, it's going to be one of the biggest things I take away from this book. Based on this, I'm going to read this whole part. Um, let's see. Uh, Surveys show that happiness tends to reach its top in the 40s, 47 to be exact. But as I learned through painful experience, middle-age distress often has its roots much earlier, in adolescence or childhood. I mean, I stopped on that sentence and was just thinking about that forever. You know, COVID. The whole COVID thing, right? So it's not like COVID killed everybody. COVID was the stressor that tipped the scale for a bunch of people of things that had been happening for years. And COVID was the thing that triggered it. And that, comparing that to emotionally, like in my 40s, some stuff went down, some pretty bad stuff, and I don't want to talk about it right now necessarily, but I often wonder if that was my emotional COVID. If, you know, that I had emotionally, psychologically, and emotionally, I had contracted an emotional and a psychological disease from the time I was very, very young. And I had the sort of the emotional equivalent of, arterial sclerosis or whatever building up in me. So I was basically emotionally diabetic. And then, just like it's just at the end of the day, COVID is the flu. It's a bad flu, but it's a flu, right? And it killed a bunch of people because they were vulnerable. And I wonder if the things that almost killed me in my middle age, and I mean they almost killed me, um, if they were triggered, basically it was like COVID. And so this is the first time I actually gave thought to the idea that the emotional diseases that I have, and I have them, I know it, started when I was very young. And it caused me to look back at my childhood and stuff. Not with as little blame as possible, by the way. It's very hard to do that and not find a way to point a finger at somebody here or there and everywhere, right? I mean, it's so easy to just blame your dad. And there's actually a line in a song I really like where uh, the singer actually says, I cannot blame my dad for X or Y or something. And he's specifically referring to another singer who's, complaining about he's all screwed up because his dad wasn't there, blah, blah, blah. It's not so much about that. I don't think it's about the blame. I think it's about understanding what happened. And the reason it seems that this week has been full of this because Lance Armstrong didn't have a dad. He grew up to be a combative, competitive asshole because he talks about some of his early days and how totally screwed up he was. And exercise and competition was a way for him to deal with it all. And so he dumped a lot into that. And then he got successful and he got picked up by people and he became, a part of the system and the poster boy for doping when in fact he wasn't the worst of the dopers, not even close. But he became the poster boy because he was so famous for all the wins that he'd done. Um, but same sort of situation, right? So the things that took him down emotionally and ethically started way 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 earlier than that. So so that got me thinking about that. So the third is emotional health. So we got to focus on our emotional health. What does it mean to stay emotionally healthy? And he's just setting up the conversations for the rest of the book. So I'm super excited to get into that. How we deal with what happened in our childhood by the time we get to middle age is a huge bearing on our physical health, our happiness, and our very survival. To me, longevity as a concept is really only meaningful to the extent that we are defying and allowing all vectors in decline simultaneously. And he talks about it and says, and to retain good health as we age, but without love, friendships, and emotional health and purpose is a purgatory I would not wish on my worst enemy. Imagine being a perfect specimen of a human being physically. You're going to live forever, but you have no relationships. You have no emotional health. I don't think you would actually. From my experience, when my emotional health is gone in the toilet, my physical health is also gone. They're like intertwined very closely, stress and stuff. So the important distinction here is that actual death is inevitable, but this deterioration that we're talking about is not. Not everyone who dies in their 80s or 90s passes through the valley of cognitive, physical, and emotional destruction on their way. They are preventable, and I believe that they are largely optional, despite their ever increasing gravitational pull over time. As we'll see in later chapters, cognitive, physical, and even emotional deterioration can be slowed and even reversed in some cases with the application of proper tactics. All right, so this next section here, tactics. The key difference between machine medicine 2.0 and 3 is that is has to do with how and quote when we apply the tactics. Medicine 2.0 only steps in the end when something's wrong. Medicine 3.0 tactics become interwoven into our daily lives. We eat, breathe, and sleep them literally. The tactics for Medicine 2.0, for Medicine 3.0, fall into 5 broad domains: exercise, nutrition, sleep. I'm so glad somebody finally has the courage to talk about sleep, emotional health, and exogenous molecules, meaning drugs, hormones, and supplements. I will not be talking about molecules because that would make this book twice as long already. But I will say that I do not shy away from pharmaceutical drugs because they are, quote, not natural. I consider many drugs and supplements, including lipid-lowering medications, to be essential items in the longevity toolkit. I hope that in the not too distant future we will have many more effectively to have at our disposal. So then he goes in and he breaks them down. So drugs and supplements aside, our first tactical domain is exercise. I don't like the word exercise. He summarizes. He doesn't like the word exercise because everybody uses it for everything. A walk, a marathon, it's all exercise. We will break this down, this thing called exercise, into its most important components: strength, stability, aerobic efficiency, and peak aerobic capacity, VO2 max. Increasing your limits in each of these areas is necessary if you hope to reach a long lifespan and health span. Again, my goal is not to tell you what to do and how to lose fat or improve your aesthetic quality or your midsection. We want to maintain physical strength, stamina, stability across a broad range of movements while remaining free from pain and disability. This is another area where my changing has drastically changed over the years. I used to prioritize nutrition over everything else, but I now consider exercise to be the most potent longevity drug in our arsenal. In terms of lifespan and health span, the data are unambiguous. Exercise not only delays actual death, but also prevents both cognitive and physical decline, better than any other intervention. We also tend to feel better when we exercise, so it probably has some harder to measure effect on emotional health as well. Hell yeah! Hell to the yeah, amen there. Dude, I can't. That's another thing that came out of the Lance Armstrong interview. The guy has so many demons that haunt him all the time from his past that what does he do? He goes out and rides on his mountain bike in Boulder by himself. It's him in the sky, in the trees, in the sun, in the road. I get it. I get it. I have a thing that I say all the time. You know, nature is my temple and running is my worship. Or endurance sports. When I go out for a run, I can't now because I'm older, so it's been more of a bike thing now. But I feel nature is literally my temple. When I'm out there, it's not like I'm a dryad or something, But I'm, I just really get it. In the very fantastic movie, what is it? The yoga one, Enlighten Up. Enlighten Up. Let me show you. It's one of the best yoga movies you'll ever watch. It's called Enlighten Up. I think it's actually free now. Enlighten Up. IMDb. It's about this journalist. Here he is. He's the focus of a documentary, and the documentary is what am I going to do with? Actually, I'm going to play this. Oh, I can't play it. I'm probably going to get, dinged. But the documentarian, Kate Churchill, she takes him through this transformation and sees what it does to him. But the reason I thought of it is because there's a quote from him at the beginning of the show that says that the quickest path to happiness, the simplest path to happiness, is physical exercise. And he's a rock climber, and he lives in Boulder, and I could not more agree with that. So in the book here, Peter says that, hey, it might have some emotional connection. It says it's harder to quantify by science, but I believe it does, and I think anybody who actually participates regularly in any kind of outdoor activity, in particular, I'm not so sure going to the gym is the same. I'm just thinking right now because when I'm like sweating nails here and I am riding my bike and I'm watching the fake, outdoor scene. Is it therapeutic? Not nearly as much as when I go for a run outside or a bike ride outside. Not even close. I get healthy. Ironically, last night when I danced, even though I drank 5 beers over 5 hours, uh, that was really good on my emotional health because I don't know if it was release or it was the dopamine from the nostalgia of the whole thing. Whatever it was very, very therapeutic, and I was able to do it for a much longer time emotionally. It was also music, right? And music speaks to my emotions. And I think a lot of times when I'm outside, I'm also got music on, not always. But anyway, I'm kind of stuck on this one thing because I think one of the things that keeps coming back to me is emotional health. And then anytime I read anything related to that, I immediately dig into it. So the second is nutrition. I won't be telling you what to eat and what no, don't eat this and that, but we will definitely get into the biochemical evidence. The best science out there says that what you eat matters, but the first order term is how much you eat. How do you go about it? What is the Goldilocks zone? Too much, too little? What's the exactly amount? How should you eat? When should you eat? We'll give some topics about that. Next is sleep. I'm going to read almost this entire section because I can't believe how much this is cool. Just yesterday, I saw Linus Does Tech. I was watching a video about how to do OBS plugins, and they featured Linus. They had a picture of Linus from very long ago. Don't know. He's a huge YouTuber, right? And his shirt said, "Sleep is for pussies." And I saw that and I wanted to reach through the screen and slap his face because I'm so tired. I'm sick and tired of people demonizing sleep. I'm not demonizing it, but demonizing it, putting it down, making you sound like you're less of a human being because you're actually recovering your body. You know what's really sad about that? If you I can go on and on this particular point. Do you know what one of the number one producers of low T is? Low testosterone. So if all these big men who go around saying they don't need any sleep, I'm too tough of a man and everything, they're significantly lowering their testosterone because they're producing more cortisol because they're not getting sleep. They're physically making themselves less of a man if you judge a man based on how much testosterone they have. Because they think sleep is for pussies. You want to know what? Sleep is for men. Sleep is for tough guys. Sleep isn't for pussies. Sleep is for smart people. Sleep is for strong people. Sleep is for athletes. Sleep is for people who have a fucking clue. There's my one swear word. I am so tired of sleep being demonized. I am just tired of it. Next is sleep, which I and many others had ignored for far too long. Fortunately, over the past decade or so, sleep has finally received the attention it deserves. Sleep is a cheat code for productivity. I love that comment. That's a great comment. So today we have a far better understanding of its importance, and what goes into the short and long term of our sleep is compromised. Spoiler, a lot. There is not much that can compare to the feeling of waking up from a great night of sleep, feeling completely refreshed and totally primed for the day. Good sleep is critical to how our innate physiological repair processes work, especially the brain. If you're a tech worker or someone who doesn't want Alzheimer's when you're 60, get sleep. Well, poor sleep triggers a cascade of negative downstream consequences from insulin resistance to cognitive decline, as well as mental health issues. I used to be one of those people who enjoyed pulling all-nighters and thought sleep was for people who had nothing better to do. Long story short, I found out just how wrong I was in a very dramatic way. I am now convinced that the, quote, non-thin Peter biggest problem was less what he ate and now that he didn't get sleep. We're talking about a guy who was doing 21-mile swims and was still putting weight on and still had problems, still had health problems and everything. He's going to tell us about what that is. And he now attributes the number one thing that was causing him all those problems to lack of sleep. I remember when I was a triathlete, uh, that I was really good at counting my heart rate in the morning and stuff like that to check how over. And I tried really hard to get 7.5 hours of sleep, but I also had two really young kids, so I was often waking up in the middle of the night changing. I was that guy. I did that. That was my thing. My wife never did. My the one thing I could say about that I did really great as a parent is I changed every diaper between, you know, 9 p.m. and 7 a.m. every single one, because that was my job. My job was to go get the baby and deal with the diaper and take the baby. And to this day, I have some sort of deep seated connection with my kids because they would look when they would see me walk in the room, saving them from the darkness and their poop and their hunger. They saw me every time, and then I would lay my child, next to. Next to my wife, and she'd roll over and feed them. We were always afraid I was going to suffocate them, and they just, they were all happy. But they knew as soon as I walked in the door that you know, I was the meal ticket. I was going to take them. Anyway, so yeah, but that's sleep. But I didn't get a lot of sleep back then, and I think the reason that that I kept a certain layer of extra fat on all the time, and I was able to get rid of that in my 40s. Strangely, I can't quite figure that one out. Other than my diet, it was my diet, and I was really, really, really mellow. I was really chill. I mean, there was because the divorce had already happened and everything, but man, I was doing lots of yoga. So yeah, anyway, I was doing triathlons and thing, and I think I was healthy, but something about not getting that sleep, I think, probably made it harder for me to stay healthy during that time. Finally, we explore the importance of emotional health, which I believe is every bit as important a component of the health span as any other. This is an area in which I have very little professional expertise, but a great deal of personal experience. So while I do not have much hard experimental data, I can talk about that. I'll share my own very long and painful journey. Um, I'll discuss that journey in chapter 17. But one phrase that from that period that has stuck with me almost like a mantra is just something from one of my therapists actually said to me. Quote, "Isn't it ironic that your entire professional life is predicated around trying to make people live longer?" She said. "Yet you're putting no energy into being less miserable and to suffering less emotionally yourself." She continued, why would you want to live longer if you're so unhappy?" Her logic was undeniable, and it changed my whole approach to longevity. And the last thing, he's broken. He's very organized. As you can tell, he's a very, very organized guy. You look at his mathematical background and everything. He's a very organized writer. You can almost see the outline underneath it. And so the last section of this chapter before we end, and this will be the end of the podcast, um, it's called "From Evidence Based to Evidence Informed," and this is really, really interesting. I again, once again, I'm just totally going to fanboy on Peter here. Peter has taken the idea of science and scientific method and netted out when it can be definitive and when it can be informative. Those are my words. Um, and yet they're still both valuable. I'm just going to read his words again. It's obviously important that our strategy use evidence. Unfortunately, the pursuit of longevity is where the most powerful tool of medicine 2.0, the randomized clinical trial in humans, sets us into a brick wall. And I won't get into all the idea of what an RCT is, but I'm going to seriously paraphrase here. He talks about the difference between, I mean, this is clearly coming from a scientist and a medical professional. He talks about that in medicine and in science, there are studies that are short term that can be quickly delivered and mastered. So, like when they're creating a vaccine or something. And then there are the longer term studies, that are very, very, very rare and very nearly impossible to do because there's so many variables. And in order to study longevity, we can't. It's very hard to use the short-term type of science to study what affects the horsemen that take effect over 10, 15, 20 years, there are, literally zero studies that cover that entire period. And he talks about, but, don't despair, because we can still look at some things. So that's the difference between evidence-based. Evidence-based is, apparently it's a term that almost always means that you're doing very official studies that show causal, relationships to things. And evidence informed, which means, these are leading us to make conclusions about individual pieces of the puzzle, even though we don't have a full, well-rounded problem there. Option B is to look at different types of data that we do have, and then develop a strategy that triangulates all of it. This method may not definitively solve the problem, but it can at least point us in the right direction. Our option B strategy is based on a combination of insights from 5 different sources of data. Viewed separately, they probably aren't ever strong on their own, but when we take them together, they can provide a solid foundation for our tactics. Our supporting framework must shift from being exclusively evidence-based, if it's not evidence-based, it doesn't matter, to evidence-informed, risk-adjusted precision medicine. So again, the combination of mathematician, statistician, somebody who's very successful, on Wall Street as well as in a medical room, is really coming to roost here. So all of his, risk analysis and risk assessment, all that stuff that would come from financial mathematics and stuff like that, is now helping him find value in what people who only had a scientific background might dismiss because it's not good enough, right? By setting a number for the risk there as to how accurate the data is. Absolutely fascinating. The evidence is made stronger by the fact that the centurions represent our species of interest. That is, they are human. Unfortunately, centurions' data is almost entirely observational rather than experiential, so we can't truly infer cause and effect. Centurion life histories and habits tend to be rather idiocentric, to say the least, and the fact that their numbers are relatively small means that it can be even difficult to draw firm conclusions of any kind. Next, we turn lifespan data to animal models, such as mice. The limitation is we're not mice. The third and important part is human studies of the horsemen themselves, the actual diseases. Cardiovascular, cerebrovascular diseases, cancer, Alzheimer's, and neurodegenerative conditions of type 2 diabetes and related metabolic dysfunction. How do these diseases begin? How do they grow? What causes them to grow? Where are they going? Those are things we can study. Fourth, we consider the molecular and mechanistic insights derived from a study of aging in humans and animal models. We've learned an enormous amount about the cellular changes that occur during aging process in specific diseases. And from that, we can develop some changes in strategies and exogenous molecules, i.e. drugs, or behavioral changes, e.g. exercise. Our final source of insight is a very clever model of analysis called the Mendelian randomization, or MR. See, this is what makes Peter unique here. He's bringing these ideas that the traditional MD would probably not have studied. We'll talk about epidemiology in more detail later, but while it is useful in certain situations, such as determining a link between cancer and smoking, it's less useful in more complex scenarios. Mendelian randomization helps tease out causal relationships between modified risks, cholesterol, and cancer, for example, in situations where actual random experience cannot easily be done. It accomplishes by letting nature do the randomization. So it's very, he kind of geeks out here, and he talks about how we can take these studies that are not the long-term awesome ones, and we can apply scientific methods to use those as scientific models for stuff that's as close as we can get to causal, even though it's still, strictly speaking, not causal. An astute reader will notice a concept has been conspicuously absent from this chapter: absolute certainty. This took me a while to get a grasp on when I went from math to medicine. But biology, we rarely care to prove anything definitive at all, like we do in math. Living systems are messy and confounded and complex, and understanding them is even a simple thing is constantly evolving. The best we can hope to do is reduce our uncertainty. A good experiment in biology only increases or decreases our confidence, but we never know for sure. Even though we know pretty well that if a doctor doesn't wash their hands and put sterile gloves on before operating on you, you'll get sick. In the absence of multiple repeat decades-long randomization critical trials, uh, we are forced to think in terms of probability and risk. In a sense, it's a bit like charting an investment strategy. And this, again, he used to help huge financial institutions make good financial. I gathered that from the last chapter, and so now we have a guy who's helping companies navigate the best financial investment, help us to make the best health span investment, best investment of our time and energy. On Wall Street, gaining an advantage like this is called alpha. We're going to borrow the idea and apply it to health. I propose that with some unorthodox and very reasonable life cycle changes, you can minimize the most serious threats to your lifespan and health span and achieve your own measure of longevity alpha. My aim here is to equip you with the tools so you can apply to your own situation, whether you want to pay attention to your glucose regulation, your weight, physical condition, Alzheimer's disease risk, or so on. Your personal tactics should never be static, but will evolve as needed as your journey through life and its uncertainties. As we learn more about the science of aging and the workings of diseases like cancer, as your own situation changes, your tactics can and must change. Because as the great philosopher Mike Tyson once put it, everyone has a plan till you get punched in the mouth. Oh, advice George Foreman could have used. So that's it. That's the end of that chapter. Again, Peter, you probably never see this, but if you ever do, thank you for this book. It's really good so far. I probably could read the whole thing in a week, but I am dragging it out because I do like savoring all the little pieces of it. Obviously, that chapter is just a kind of an introduction. Like, hey, get ready, here comes the real stuff. But I've never been more confident in the approach to the book so far as outlined in that chapter. I mean, it at every level, it checks off the boxes with me, right? It uses as much science as we can reliably use without dismissing the science that we can't. It has a certain amount of faith in our ability to figure everything out, even though it's very forthcoming in that it's saying that we absolutely don't know anything. It's just really, just really good. So I'm going to end the podcast there. Hopefully you get a chance to read it. I mean, if you find this podcast interesting and you've got something to add, please let me know. You can bring it up anytime, preferably when I'm not drunk and dancing. But, whether it be through Discord or something, I would really love to hear what you have to say about it. But I'm perfectly content just telling you what I think. So on that note, I'm going to go ahead and end it. But thank you so much for joining.